Three, two, one, recording. I've got some nice new music now as well in the start. Ron, welcome back. How you doing?
Hi, Daniel. I'm doing very well, thank you. And thank you for having me back. And how are you doing?
I'm doing fine, thank you. I'm doing well. Yeah, so the first time we chatted, it was extremely educational for me. There's a couple of questions I got from some of the listeners. I'm going to quickly just say your full title. Ron is a clinical social worker, sexologist, activist, and full-time academic at UCT, the University of Cape Town. And last time we chatted about gender identity issues. So, I mean, someone like me, I'm a layman. Um, and thank you for articulating so well last time to all the questions I had around this topic. Um, if you are if you are listening and you wonder why it's so interesting to me, I just care about human rights, and actually I care about the legal side of it, but I do work in consumer psychology. So the more conversations I have about psychology, the more I actually understand what I'm doing in consumer psychology, and what people think about when they make buying decisions, because I'm in marketing. So thank you for coming back, Ron. And yeah, I had some questions for you today, but I first wanted to just touch on two subjects. The one being, are you seeing? So obviously, COVID has created the space where we now talk to each other on Zoom, and I mean, technology sort of helped me with it as well because of my podcast. So I'm able to do like 2 episodes a week. There's not a lot of driving from A to B, and the logistics of it is a bit easier. But how does it affect you in your work in terms of seeing people in the clinical space?
Sure. So yeah, it has affected it positively and negatively, I guess, is I'll divide it into two. So well, before COVID happened, I mean, I think they often call it telehealth or teletherapy, is a format of accessing, psychotherapeutic and health services that already exists, and it's platforms that have been around for a while. But platforms was not familiar with and did not know. I'm very much, up until COVID, the traditional therapist that I would be seeing my clients in my consulting room, in my office, and engaging with them, and going with them. If it's dealing with social transition at work, it's myself with my client, in the corporate and or workspace. So what did then, of course, need to happen was I then very quickly had to learn. I mean, I'd never known Zoom existed up until March of this year,
Yeah.
and that both because of academia as well as the clinical work. So the negative was that of the clients that I was seeing at the time, I then obviously could not see them in the office anymore, but then I made the offer to be able to do the consultations online using formats like Zoom and WhatsApp video. And so I don't see a lot of clients because academia is my dominant job, but I am seeing a few. So two of the clients that I was seeing themselves didn't feel comfortable with moving from the personal office space to an online space. And so they chose to rather pause, the therapy and the counseling. And that's to do with their own particular, issues around tech. So that was a negative in that, so not all clients do feel that this is a platform or a space that they can engage with, and that has implications for ongoing, and accessing, counseling. And then there are three of the clients that I've been seeing that were comfortable. And interestingly, I mean, not to be ageist in what I'm going to say, the two clients that were not comfortable with it were older clients.
Okay.
And the three clients that said, no, it's fine, they'll do Zoom and WhatsApp, were younger clients that, had grown up with technology, obviously a lot more. So yeah, so I do therapy with my clients using Zoom and WhatsApp. I was honestly, I was kind of quite anxious about it. I'm very much, as I was saying to you earlier before we started, for me, kind of the the kind of being able to read my client's body language, their energy in the room is a significant part of how I work.
Right.
As a psychodynamic psychotherapist, I'm not going to go into the technicalities of it, but we work within what's called the transference and the counter-transference dynamic, and the unconscious interaction that's also happening in the therapeutic space. And I was really concerned about how that was going to be affected. And it has been affected, but nowhere nearly as badly or as severely as I thought it was going to. So I'm still seeing, so this has been a number of months now, and I'm still seeing the 3 clients, and it's going well. So I must give credit to that technology can work, and it is, I think, does keep access to counseling viable and possible for clients willing to use those platforms. And I just needed to adjust certain things for myself as the therapist, but it's been going well. So it can work and it can be effective.
Okay.
But it depends on the clients as well.
Sure. And for your students, I mean, they'll be coming back soon, or is it gonna, I mean, you have mentioned that the larger classes won't be able to come back, but
well, okay, so for the the whole of 2020, we're not coming back at UCT.
Okay.
So
it'll be Zoom
UCT has
classes.
decided that both the semesters are going to remain as remote teaching. Students that have returned to campus at the moment are the clinical students, so our social work students, so those that need to be on campus to go and do their practicals, so our social work students that need to go and see clients, the doctors, the healthcare students are back on campus so that they can do their clinical practice. But the teaching is all staying online for the rest of this year. And then next year, UCT has so far decided that we're going to take a blended learning approach, meaning that next year, all classes, I think 100 that have 100 or more students in it, will not have face-to-face teaching. We will then continue similarly as we are doing at the moment, where we're going to be, delivering the content online in the form of narrated PowerPoints, etc., and chat room engagements. So yeah, that has been a significant adjustment for me as an academic. Again, seeing that in this troubled time, we were still able to make the teaching accessible, and we could continue the academic project with these adjustments. Of course, it had many challenges because not all of our students are of the same privilege and socioeconomic background. So yeah, our students are at home, most of them, and so having access to internet and technology and equipment. But UCT has done a lot to support those students. So I've had to adjust to, and again, similarly to my therapy, my style of teaching is very interactional. It's very much engaging my students in debate and conversation. So I had to adjust how I was able to do that. But it's all in all, it's worked out better than I had been concerned that it would. So it hasn't been too bad.
I suppose it's easier to have a pandemic in 2020 than the 1918 Spanish flu.
Well, I mean, I think even if we'd had this in the 1990s or the 80s or the 2000s, I think even then we didn't have the technology that we have now. It would have been a disaster. I would imagine that we would have just stopped the academic process and things. We would just lose academic years until we were able to get going again.
No, true. I mean, it's technology's come a long way, and I found the same with work. So we all work remotely, but people who are living in sort of in rural areas and the township, there's quite a few problems with connections, but that's all been sorted out now. So yeah, it took a while though, and I think for me actually, the pandemic and the lockdown that happened afterwards really showed me how privileged I was, and I mean I knew it before, but I always just took it for granted. And the fact that I can work from home is a massive privilege, and it's just something to be thankful for. I wanted to talk to you a bit about your what sort of media you do. Do you ever get journalists from you know, I want to say newspapers and TV, but these days everything's on blogs and YouTube. Do you ever get journalists asking you to sort of give them a bit more information for the media?
Absolutely. So, and that's been happening for quite a number of years. Um, just to say, so I'll speak to that in a moment. I mentioned in our previous podcast that I'm a member of the transgender clinic at Curtis Fear Hospital. I'm one of the multidisciplinary team members. And one of my roles that's been allocated to me as part of that team is to manage the media requests that come to the team as well. So often if journalists, contact Dr. Addinall, who's our chair, for media input, she will then refer the journalist to me. So I very much do that on behalf of the clinic or the transgender clinic. But yeah, it's been quite a number of years. So I've done, well, I'll give you the credit, Daniel. This is the very first ever podcast I've done as a form of media. So you broke my virginity.
Awesome.
But yeah, I think over the last 5 or so years, I've done Carte Blanche a few times. I was part of the I've gone blank. In Europe, they've got this series called the Taboo series. Now I've forgotten the company that has the Taboo series. They wanted to then launch a Taboo series in Africa. And the very first Taboo documentary they did was on gender identity or transgender persons in Africa. So myself and Dr. Kevin Adams, the plastic surgeon, we contributed to that. And so that's the very first ever documentary done in South Africa on telling the stories of transgender clients in South Africa. And then, yeah, I've done a lot of radio and I've done South African stuff. I've done ENCA, I've done Espresso, I've Weekend Argus, Sunday Times, You Magazine, family magazines, baby magazines. So yeah, I've done the.
You got that's quite a good list there.
So they often tease me at work. You kind of like I act like I'm some kind of a celebrity, and kind of hand out my autograph.
Well, you are now, Ron. You're on Juice Ready.
Absolutely. Well, you're expanding my celebrity.
Well, no, the pleasure's all mine. And I think one of the questions me, I'm a bit of a slow learner. And one of the things that I still am not really able to articulate very well is the difference between gender disorder and gender dysmorphia, and when was it recognized as, so when was it officially changed, and why was the terminology changed? And if you could just include in that question, which rights activist group was it that got that changed, if you remember? Sure. And because I'm very interested in change and why things take so long to change, and it's 2020 and we're still fighting for individual rights. And to me, that's crazy, but I'm going to do whatever I can to sort of accelerate that change.
No, excellent. So then just a bridge to that. So part of why I've been kind of a media slut, if I can use that terminology, cool, is that I do think that media is a very powerful medium for education. So as a social worker, besides that, I work with individuals and with groups. Part of community work as a social worker is, community education and community awareness. So kind of my engagement in all of the media that I've spoken about was exactly the purpose, and exactly what we're doing now is I do think, you're able to reach larger numbers of the general population with the information that they need. And that's why I think podcasts like yours and the media, are a tool to, sure, make that information available. So to your question, so I think, so let's just get the terminology correct. So there is what was called gender identity disorder.
Okay.
So gender identity disorder was the official psychiatric diagnosis that was in the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which is very much the American system of diagnoses of psychiatric disorders. And in the DSM, presently we have, so how these diagnostic systems work is every number of years, they update the diagnostic criteria, and certain diagnoses will fall away. New diagnoses may be introduced based on the latest, evidence-based research. So there's normally what happens with these kinds of diagnostic categories is every number of years, there's a huge international conference where all the various scientists and researchers come together. They pool the latest evidence-based research and knowledge, and then they get committees that have to then work on the various diagnostic categories and make decisions. Is what we know today and the diagnostic categories we have still valid, or is there now enough evidence that they need to be adapted, adjusted, or even be removed? And I think it's important that we understand that because you're talking about what drives change.
Right.
So within within kind of the clinical arena and diagnoses, there is absolutely, it's about evidence-based research. It's conference-led, and multiple disciplines normally engaged in the process. So which resulted in, so presently today we have the DSM-5. So before 2013, we had the DSM-4, obviously, so they work with the numerical sequencing. So in the DSM-4, there was the diagnosis gender identity disorder. And that was the official psychiatric diagnosis that clinicians had to give to a transgender person. And if they weren't given that diagnosis, it actually ended up, so what happened was clinicians were often then the gatekeepers. Because if you didn't see a clinician who diagnosed you with gender identity disorder, you couldn't access gender-affirming hormone treatment, and you couldn't access gender-affirming surgery. And it was a mental disorder. So it meant you were diagnosed with a psychiatric illness called gender identity disorder.
Okay.
So, and we covered all of the history of that in the previous podcast. So all the research was done, all of the theories, were debunked. And significantly in the lead up to the DSM-5 being released and the decision that was made to remove gender identity disorder from the diagnostic, categories, this was informed by the decision that was finally made that being transgender is not a psychiatric disorder. Similarly, as in 1973, where the decision was finally made that homosexuality was not a psychiatric disorder and was removed from the then DSM. And at that time, again, because I keep holding in my head, you want to understand how change happened. So besides the science that was being done and the research that, the evidence-based research, there were a lot of activist groups. And you asked about, so these were activist groups from around the world. So these were activist groups, in the United States, in Europe, from the African continent. So basically we cannot credit one particular, advocacy group. There was really a concerted, coordinated effort around the globe, which is, again, thanks to the technology we have today,
Sure.
that's possible, that people on various continents can get together, in virtual space and advocate and, challenge the status quo. So they played a role. And then what started to happen was a number of the international healthcare bodies. So for example, the international bodies of psychology, of social work, of psychiatry, of endocrinology, of urology, etc., started taking the stand and proclaiming that from their profession's perspective, being transgender was not a psychiatric illness. So basically, all of those elements kind of came together that in 2013, when the DSM-5 was released, gender identity disorder was no longer part of the diagnostic criteria. And it was officially declared that being transgender was not a psychiatric illness. So that's the one concept that you refer to. But now the challenge for transgender persons is, which is different, for example, using the homosexuality as an example, is that for transgender persons, part of their journey means that they may need to access healthcare. They may need to access gender affirming treatment. They may need to access gender affirming surgery. Now, part of the challenge, and that's still what we're dealing with today, is that when it comes to treatment and intervention, the medical model is still the dominant model that you will find in the healthcare arena.
Yeah.
And the medical model says you cannot prescribe a medication or, recommend a surgery if you're not doing it against a diagnosis.
Right.
So what then happened, and this will bring us to the second concept that you were talking about. So what happened with when the DSM-5 was released, they removed gender identity disorder and made the declaration that it is not a mental illness. But what they then included was, and that's the second concept, so there is a diagnostic category in the DSM called gender dysphoria. Mm. But what is important to understand, so yes, it is a diagnosis and it is in the DSM, which is the Psychiatric Mental Disorders Manual. But the position that was taken and how it is articulated is that gender dysphoria is not the diagnosis of a mental illness. It's not a psychiatric disorder. It is essentially, and as to kind of simplistically kind of explain it, it's a descriptive diagnosis, and almost kind of like, and this is my term, I'm just like a placeholder diagnosis. And basically what gender dysphoria means is it's a description of an experience the person is having. So gender dysphoria is, because I was assigned a particular gender at birth, and the gender that I'm experiencing myself to be, to actually be, I experience within myself a discomfort, and a significant discomfort that can cause me a clinically significant level of distress. It may even mean that I then, I could struggle with depression. I could struggle with anxiety disorder. I could experience a range of consequences. But basically, gender dysphoria means presently, within myself, I am in a state of tension or distress because my experienced gender doesn't, match my assigned, gender at birth. So that's the diagnosis that exists at the moment in the DSM. So when I, for example, am, seeing but it's still controversial. So I don't want to make it seem like, so a lot of activists are still saying that there should be no diagnosis at all in the DSM. And for a person to access it should be a person's choice, and they should be able to have an informed consent approach to whether they would want to have hormones or have, gender affirming surgery. It shouldn't be determined by medical practitioners and healthcare practitioners using a diagnosis. Okay, right. So the compromise that was reached, because a lot of, because remember, this is the American Association and they have a lot more resources than the US. But a lot of trans people in Africa, in Asia, in Southern America were concerned that if there was no diagnosis, they had no negotiation with their medical systems in their country.
Sure.
So it kind of became this compromise. So gender dysphoria was the diagnosis placed in the DSM. And essentially, so if I see a client, I would do an assessment and I would give them the diagnosis of that they experience gender dysphoria. That it's not you are diagnosed with the mental illness, gender dysphoria. And so because you experience gender dysphoria, you need to then go through possibly various aspects of transition. That would include social transition elements, possibly hormone affirming treatments and or surgeries. And the thinking is that once the person has done what they need to do, let's say they've now transitioned and let's use the example of a trans woman. She's now living as a woman. She's expressing her gender as a woman. People are using, a female name. They're using the female pronouns. And she felt that she needed hormone treatment, and she maybe chose to have certain gender affirming surgeries. Now, why I'm saying it that way, Daniel, I know I end up saying a lot at the same time, is not all transgender persons want exactly the same thing.
Okay.
So it's every transgender person has to decide for themselves. So some persons might only do social transition. Some people might, want to do social transition and only have one surgery and not take hormones. Someone might want to take hormones first for a while, maybe, and then do social transition and choose not to have any surgeries. So it's just important that your learners, your listeners understand that it is individualized.
Yeah,
it's not a one size fits all. That's a good way to put it. So, but essentially, the person gets the gender dysphoria diagnosis, and they now do what they need to do. Once they've completed what they need to do, and they're now comfortable, they're now happy in how they're presenting in the world, and they're no longer experiencing distress, that diagnosis falls away. That's what I meant by it's kind of a placeholder diagnosis, and a diagnosis that's describing an experience. It's not diagnosing the person with a mental illness. So that's the diagnosis. So gender identity disorder is now a swear word. It is placed in history. It is treated with the despise that it deserves.
It's a pariah.
We have, it's now become the pariah. So we have the gender dysphoria diagnosis at the moment. And there's a lot of advocacy that is, as I've said, still happening at the moment. So it'll be interesting to see when the next DSM is updated in however many years, if at that point in time, even the gender dysphoria may fall away and there'll be no diagnosis needed. And hopefully, this is what a lot of activists are feeling for adult transgender persons, is that they can take an informed consent approach and not need a diagnosis or clinicians to give them the letters that allows them, to move forward with their processes. Because people like myself, or the mental health practitioners for a long time in the history were very much seen as like we were the obstacle to people just getting on with their lives. Why must I sit with a therapist if I know who I am?
Right.
And why do I have to have the therapist letter? And that gave us a lot of power, and that resulted in a lot of resentment on the side of the transgender community as to them being able to be empowered in their own right. Their own right to self-determination.
And make
felt like it was. And of course, we live in a world where the medical arena has status and it has power. We talk about privilege all the time. So as healthcare practitioners, part of a number of things that we've had to learn through this journey is also to understand our power. And essentially we are meant to do no harm. So kind of figuring that out has been an interesting journey. So that's gender dysphoria, just as an interest, because South Africa, we have a very interesting scenario. So the DSM, which I've been speaking about, is an American system. The rest of the world uses another system called the ICD system, the International Code of Diseases system. Now, it was 2 years, I think it was, I'm sorry, my years are starting to blend. I think it was the middle of last year. The ICD-11 was finally released. So we had DSM-4 that became DSM-5 in 2013, the American diagnostic system. The rest of the world is using the ICD system, and they also went through a review. What's different about the two systems is, so the DSM is American based and it's under the auspices of the American Psychiatric Association. The ICD system falls under the World Health Organization, so it's much bigger. And whenever the ICD codes are updated, as it happened now that we have ICD-11, Once all the, and they go through a very similar process. It's international research conferences, people are brought together, then various committees are created of academics and healthcare practitioners and advocates to review all of the various diagnoses and make decisions whether, and then they even do research on possible changes to the diagnoses before they then kind of put together what would then be the next version of the system, of the ICD system, which was 11 now. But before it gets ratified, it actually goes to the General Assembly, where all the health ministers of the member states have to vote for the ratification of the new ICD diagnostic system. So the it has, so the process and the steps and the ratification for the ICD-10 is so much more robust and
Yeah.
much bigger than the DSM. But
Yeah.
in South Africa, we have this unique scenario where a lot of doctors and mental health practitioners are trained using the the DSM diagnostic system. But whenever we have to put our diagnoses on medical aid forms, we must put the equivalent ICD code, which is ridiculous. I mean, there's a lot of people in South Africa that are saying we need to do away with one of the systems, and the dominant position is the DSM, and that we all just use the international ICD-10 system. Now, the DSM went with gender dysphoria to replace, or I mean, we did away with gender identity disorder, no longer a mental illness, gender dysphoria as the placeholder diagnosis. The ICD-10 supported that entire process, so they were part of the DSM process as well. The ICD then also removed gender identity disorder. They've officially also declared it's no longer a psychiatric illness. And they created a separate chapter now outside of the mental disorder. So no longer in the psychiatric chapters, they've created a separate chapter where they've also put a placeholder descriptive diagnosis, and they went with gender incongruence. So if I'm going to use the ICD-11 diagnosis for my client, I'm going to diagnose gender incongruence. If I'm going to be using the DSM, I'm going to use gender dysphoria. In essence, it's the same function. A lot of us feel that the gender incongruence is a much better diagnostic concept because it emphasizes incongruence. There is an incongruency between my gender I experience myself to be and the gender that I was assigned at birth.
Yeah.
The problem with gender dysphoria, the term dysphoria, the way it's described, it basically implies a certain almost level of distress that has to be diagnosed. And so it often gets misused, or can be misused, that if you're not distressed enough, if you don't express enough almost,
Exasperation.
distress and angst with your experience, you're not going to get the diagnosis.
Right.
And the reality is not all transgender people experience an intense distress. They just know who they are.
Right.
And so sometimes they feel they have to almost perform distress to get that diagnosis to access the treatment.
Yeah, which also...
So I very much, am in favor of the gender incongruence terminology for the diagnosis. And it's also the fact that they've taken it, it's not in any psychiatric part of the ICD system. I can't remember now, but they created a separate chapter to deal with issues around sexuality and health and sexual health, and they've placed this in that chapter, and so that's further affirming that we are no longer talking about a mental disorder. We're talking about an experience that people have. And then similarly, you get diagnosed with gender incongruence, you do what you need to do. And once you've done whatever you've needed to do and you're now happy and you're living your authentic self in all areas of your life, that diagnosis falls away because then you're no longer experiencing incongruence.
Oh, I see.
There's
Okay.
no incongruency between
Right.
your lived experience and you go on with life without a mental disorder diagnosis.
Okay, and this is going to bring me back to privilege, but there's two other issues I want to cover with you today, and then there's a couple of other issues that we can maybe chat about on another podcast. But I read somewhere that so this is kind of a double barrel question. So obviously, and the part that brings me back to privilege is obviously the cost. So let's say Daniel, I'm with Discovery. I pay them a monthly medical aid subscription fee, which is more like a, you know, monthly, I don't know what to call it, retainer, subscription fee. Anyway, I'm a Discovery client and I I need to come to you I need to see somebody about incongruency, and Discovery obviously doesn't always pay for that. Unless, so how does it work in terms of the costs? I mean, it's obviously a very expensive procedure and entire process. And I'm not just talking about, socially transitioning or hormone therapy. I'm actually talking about also the scalpel and the surgery. And also, so at the Groote Hospital, I read somewhere that the waiting time for, um, I think it's 25 years for a
For, gen-
gender reassignment.
for
So,
gender,
so,
gender affirming surgery. Yeah.
so how does it work with the waiting
Okay.
time being 25 years, and how do we
Okay.
accelerate that change?
Well, you've highlighted the important marking points in the question that you're asking. So, so the situation we have today. So yes, so internationally, gender identity is now well understood and it is well researched, and we have the improvements in the diagnostic system. Um, the problem is that, and still in South Africa, so it kind of, what happens is you have 2 steps forward and 10 steps back a lot of the time. But the shorthand is, in Cape Town, let me use the Cape Town scenario to illustrate it. Because we have the transgender clinic at Groote Hospital, which is a state hospital, and because the transgender clinic is part of the state hospital, it is governed by the same rules as all of the other departments within the Groote Hospital. So whether you're going to go to Groote because you have a heart condition, or you need a hip replacement, or you have diabetes or whatever, and you are accessing the transgender clinic, the same rules apply. So you're a state patient. So if you don't have an income, and you earn below us, because I think they also have like a sliding scale, and also if you don't have medical aid, then that's who the largest percentage of our population utilize the state hospitals and state clinics. So that's applicable to our transgender clients as well. So as you remember, I saw most of my clients at Triangle Project, where also that's an NPO. There wasn't an obstacle, financial obstacle, and they could be seen, they could receive the mental health and psychosocial support. I could refer them to Groote Hospital. The clinic would receive them, take them on board, and then refer them to endocrine and refer them to the plastic surgery department.
Okay,
So all of that runs.
sorry, Ron, is that covered by the state, or is that
Yes.
covered by, so the NPO is financed by the state, and that treatment
No,
is
okay.
available to people who can't
So the
afford it?
NPO, all that we get so a Triangle Project, which is the NPO,
Yeah.
is they get to see a mental health practitioner.
Okay.
So someone like myself, and I'll do an assessment of the client. And yeah, so Triangle Project is funded by, they're constantly, and they're almost closed twice in the last while. So they do get some funding from the Department of Health. They do get some funding from the Department of Social Development and other funders. But primarily what Triangle is able to offer as a NPO is people like myself. I'm a volunteer therapist for them. So they do pay me a stipend, but it's nothing near what you would actually charge for those sessions.
Okay.
And they give that to us, from their funding. So a client can be seen at Triangle Project by myself. I'll do the assessment, and then out of the assessment, they wish to go on gender affirming treatment and or access surgery. I can then refer them to the transgender clinic at Groote Hospital. Then they get an appointment there. I just happen to also be on their multidisciplinary team, but it's two different entities. There's the NPO, and then there's the state hospital. So now I've referred them to the transgender clinic at Groote Schuur Hospital. They get an appointment. They go and see Dr. Murray and the psychiatrist, Dr. Don Wilson and John Torlin are the team that then receive the clients. And then they refer them to the endocrine department for access to hormones. And they refer them to Dr. Kevin Adams at plastic surgery for access to surgery. Okay, so that all runs according to the typical state. So the fact that the person's unemployed and doesn't have medical aid is not an obstacle.
Okay.
So they will get seen by the team at the clinic. They will get referred to endocrine, and they'll get referred to plastic surgery. So for endocrine, within about 3 to 4 months on average, they will have seen an endocrinologist. They will have had their blood test done, and they will be prescribed hormones. So accessing the hormones via the state, it is, there is waiting lists and waiting times, but we're talking about months at a time.
Okay.
Then they get referred to Kevin as well. So Kevin sees them initially and puts them on the list. Now, this is where the 25-year story comes in. So how a state hospital essentially works is, there's only so many surgeries in, places where surgery can happen in a hospital. And all of the surgeries of all the different departments have to be done there. So the heart transplants and the hip replacements and the appendixes and everything. So the hospital has a formula that it works out. And this formula kicks out how many hours are allocated for hips and hearts and pancreases and et cetera, et cetera. And presently, the formula kicks out what basically adds up to 4 gender-affirming surgeries in a year.
Okay. And on the waiting list is 100 people.
Is over 200 people. And that's what's happening. So Dr. Adams can, at Groote Schuur, only do 4 surgeries in a year. But on a monthly basis, anywhere to 3 to possibly 6 or 7 people are being added to that waiting list. So the waiting list is exponentially getting longer, while still only 4 surgeries are able to be done. And again, so this is part of the battle that we have. So, but we have 4 state hospitals in the Western Cape.
Okay,
but the surgery is only happening at Groote Schuur. So why is the Tygerberg Hospital also not on board yet?
Is it a staff issue? Like, I hear you saying Kevin Adams. Well, is he the only?
So Kevin Adams works at Groote Schuur Hospital.
But he's not a gender reassignment specialist, is he? He does.
He is. He's a plastic surgeon, and he's probably one of the people that have done the most gender-affirming surgeries in the country.
Okay, so he is
but he's paid by the state, so he does those 4 surgeries. He also does work in the private sector, but that's separate. Okay, so that's the reality for the clients at the moment. Now, what makes the reality even worse is what you were speaking about earlier. So now we have the medical aids. So if I see a client who has medical aid, the medical aid will cover the therapy sessions often, because therapy and counseling doesn't matter what the diagnosis is that they're being getting the therapy for. They can get their therapy.
Sure.
At the moment, you now have to refer them for hormone treatment. So if you have a biological male having to be given estrogen, that kicks all kinds of things in medical aid systems, but there's a conflict here. How can you give female hormones to a biological male client, for example?
Right.
So there are a number of the medical aids that do not cover and include in their package coverage for gender affirming hormone treatment for transgender persons. And most of all of them essentially do not include coverage of gender affirming surgery. So what does that mean? Where do everyone go? They go to Groote Schuur and get themselves put on the list.
Okay.
unless they're able to pay for it themselves.
Yeah.
And we are looking at, and I mean, Kevin would need to give numbers, but it's anything between, depending on what surgeries you're having as a trans man or a trans woman, and there are various steps to the surgeries, and for a trans man there could be chest surgery, and there could be genital surgery. For trans women there can be breast augmentation, maybe facial feminizing surgery, and genital surgery. So there's a whole range of possibilities, and I think that the lowest number I seem to remember cost-wise is we're looking at kind of literally like 400,000 to R1,000,000.
Yeah.
People don't have that money.
Sure.
I mean, I've had clients in the past that have sold a home so that they could have their surgery. I've had people that were lucky to get their surgery because they got an inheritance.
Yeah. No, so
But
once again, there's a big disparity between haves and have-nots. And I think
but here, even the haves who have the that have the
not
medical
everyone who
aid,
has 400,000 to R1,000,000. Yeah.
exactly, and so the persons that have medical aid, who are definitely privileged to people that don't have medical
Sure.
aids, even those in the privilege of people who have medical aid, the transgender persons are still not privileged. So there is presently a lot of activism happening. And at one stage, things were looking very positive. In the Obama era, in a number of American states, they started covering and paying for and covering gender-affirming healthcare. Because here's the irony, the research has already been done. Because of course, with medical aids, it's about money.
Sure. I know that.
The research has already been done. The cost, yes, it's an initial higher cost for surgeries. But the long-term cost to a medical aid for a transgender person who doesn't get the gender-affirming care they need, the mental and psychiatric and other consequences over their lifetime, is actually going to cost the medical aids more.
Yes.
Than actually covering the gender-affirming treatment that the client actually needs. Now, during the Obama era, a lot of states started covering gender-affirming healthcare, hormones, and surgery. And there seemed to be this kind of global kind of awakening. And we here, our team at Groote Schuur, we often are engaging with the South African medical aids, and there's a body that kind of oversees all the medical aids. We've had multiple meetings, we've done the presentations. And you always get that we hear you, and this is absolutely, this is, we need to do something about it. But we do know in the end, I don't know if it's the actuaries who finally decide financially what can and can't be done, but it never gets to fruition. And then, of course, to put too a hard point on it, we then had Obama leave, and I'll follow Whoopi Goldberg, he who shall not be named.
Yeah.
Reversed.
I'm already guessing that the states that sort of supported this were the blue states that I won't name I won't name anybody. Yeah.
And since he's been in power, so much of those gains were reversed. And so we've literally had this kind of halting of the momentum of having the medical aids seriously kind of committing to engaging with this. So I know, for example, Discovery and one or two other medical aids, what they have done, I can't remember there's a term they use where so basically a client would need to have the most expensive package, be on it for a period of time, and then there's this window thing which they can try and motivate for coverage of the surgery, and they might get it.
See, to me that's interesting because I mean, he who should not be named, he is about business, and I obviously have a big problem with him for many reasons. But the one thing he seems to be good at is the economy. And, there's a lot of social divides and cultural divides that he's absolutely useless at trying to, repair those gaps and bridge those gaps. But with the economy, he seemed to be good. And I'm not sure if it's for the very rich elite or the middle class. I'm going to have someone on the podcast that knows a bit more about law and talk to him about the blue and red states. Which might be an interesting episode, but to me, it just seems counterintuitive. If if you have someone on your medical aid and they cost you a bit in the beginning, and someone's happiness, because I mean, at the core of your self-esteem is your identity, and
And also your emotional and psychological well-being.
correct. And then
And if
your
you're emotionally psychologically healthy and well, you're going to take care of your physical health. You're
correct,
going to be motivated to kind of, see your doctor regularly, address issues.
correct.
No, absolutely. And I think with he
Yeah,
who
so
shall not be named is,
yeah,
his whole kind of anti-Obamacare movement. So the whole
I think that's what it was. It was
healthcare
inspired. It was
system
more
in
a
the US is a
yeah,
total nightmare. And then added to that, the reversing of various, protections for transgender persons in America, he's reversed as well.
yeah.
So around
It
the
seems like
health
just
system and the LGBTQI, he has created much
yeah.
problems.
Yeah, that's not even then it's probably not even an economic factor. It's just
Yeah.
a sort of a FU to Obama because I think he saw him as a bit of a rival and whatever he could scrap in terms of I'm not sure exactly how it works in the Senate there, but I think anything that was put through by a Democrat just got reversed because he wanted to be a dick. So anyway, I'll take the opportunity to bash him whenever I can. Um,
Yeah.
but thank you for clarifying that. And so really the 25 years waiting time is a little bit sort of not dishonest, but it's just a number that the system spits out
Yeah.
when it's trying to tell you your waiting time. Had you finished your point, Ron, or
Yeah,
were you
absolutely.
still
Well,
busy?
and we understand it as well. I mean, the state hospitals have limited resources, and we understand. Uh, uh, heart transplants are life-saving interventions. So
Yeah.
I don't think there's a position that the hospital is being unfair. Um, the commitment of resources are what they are. And that's what the outcome is. And the part of why the state system is overburdened is because the medical aid system isn't coming to the party.
Okay.
Because a significant number of the clients on that waiting list do have medical aids. And if the medical aids do the right thing, they can come off the list and they can access their treatment through the private sector and through the private medical sector. And then so that it's only the truly needy patients that that don't have those resources would then access the state, resources. And then these kinds of excessive waiting periods can be significantly reduced.
Okay. Yeah, there's a couple of things I'd like to chat to you about again in a week or two.
Sure.
To me, it's very obviously the stuff you said earlier that it really interests me is how technology actually accelerates change. That's a very interesting one to me because that's actually the reason I really want to I really want to make as big as I can, big a difference as I can with Juice Ready, and we do deal in technology. So we do
Hmm.
we do search engines, we build websites, we build apps. So that's a cool. I just think that's an interesting thing that and the big tech companies they do sort of lean left and they do sort of go for that social change even though they are so dominated by white males like Google and Facebook. But I think that's just a thing of men prefer gadgets and tech a bit more, and women prefer working with people a bit more. I could get into trouble for saying that, but it's
I'm not
just a
going to touch that,
generalization.
Daniel. I'm going to
Yeah.
leave that with you.
Okay. Well, there we go. We'll see what happens in the YouTube comments. No, but I mean, so that is a generalization, but it's not to say that some women don't absolutely love coding and programming. Um,
Yeah.
and
Well,
then
but I do like what you're saying then. I think that is important, and I'm sure you probably are going to address a wide number of other issues as well. But absolutely, the transgender community needs their allies. And allies can be, left-leaning tech companies
right.
that, can, if they come to understand what the challenges are and what the obstacles are, and make a difference, make a contribution, or even just add their voice to these kinds of causes, already can make a difference. And I do think technology, is, we know it. I mean, it's a powerful entity in the reality of the world we live in today. So even with issues like this, I think that they can be a powerful
Yeah.
influencing ally
Well, I
for the transgender community and other vulnerable groups as well.
well, yeah. So I mean, I've already taken a bit of heat from Christians just from covering such issues. So
Mm.
I can take the heat. What I will say to people is if they're offended by anything I say, get in touch with me and find out why I said it. Because I'm doing a podcast, I'm probably going to piss off a few people. I'm a straight white privileged male. I get it. But what led me into sort of talking about LGBT rights is actually a conversation that I had, and I'm still having quite a few more conversations about gender-based violence. And
Mm.
I've now there's a group called Langer for Men who are going to come on next week. And yeah, I mean, the invitation is open to Langer for Men that we are going to help them with their media, any websites that they need built, any search engine rankings that they need, any keyword research they need, anything they need to be on the first page of Google for. We're going to help them get there. So
Yes.
in a way, Juice Ready is kind of a non-profit um, organization because I want to help. So yeah, I'm sort of a left-leaning tech company in that way, and then there's people that really need allies. So yeah, if I say something that someone doesn't like, I actually encourage them to come and talk to me and come on the
Yeah.
podcast and talk to me about it. Um, so I think next time I chat to you, we'll bring up some of the other hard topics. There was like your time in SANDF, your time in the army. I wanted to talk about testosterone flushing. Uh, the sort of media circus and the dramatization of LGBT's community and what the media does. Um, and then two other points, sort of women in sports and what's happening with when I say so women's sports and the um, the transgender community, sort of trans women in sports, and for me specifically, because I have another podcast where we talk about combat sports. So
Mm.
we talk about the UFC, um, we talk about Bellator and like all sort of MMA and boxing commentary and analysis. And one of the questions that I've had into my inbox. This wasn't one on one of the YouTube comments. This was an anonymous one, but there's a couple of women that are they were sort of assigned a male gender at birth, and they transitioned to women, and they're participating in wrestling and MMA. And I just wanted to get your opinion on that. And then
Mm.
also we probably I wanted to chat to you about why Cape Town seems to be, the
So liberal.
yeah. So it's we've run out of time now, but I'd love to have you back to chat about more of these issues. And I think you just
I'd
are
love
the
to.
you are the best person to sort of articulate in the best way of explaining it to everyone. And my listeners are very thankful to have you. And it was very important to talk to you again today.
Well, thank you for that affirmation. And any contribution I can make, I'm happy to make.
Well, yeah, thank you for coming on, and I'll hopefully chat to you again soon.
We'll do. All the best. Go well.
All the best, you too, Ron.